You are listening to Missed Apex Podcast. We live F1. Welcome to Missed Apex Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Reddy, but my friends call me Spanners. So, let's be friends. Today, we are going to this time preview the next Grand Prix, which is Interlagos. One of my favourites on the calendar, one that throws up good racing, and one where the weather forecast is likely to make things interesting as well. And we also have more of your comments of what you reckon. We have abandoned doing questions, because what's the point in asking me a question? I'm not an expert. As the YouTube comments frequently remind me, I just come on here and tell you guys what I reckon. So I want to know what you reckon as well. Let's find out what Scott Stuffy Tuffy reckons. New dad. Congratulations, Scott.
Thank you, mate. Yes, I am. Anyone watching the live video will see the heavy bags under my eyes. It's going swimmingly well.
It's not a Halloween costume. He just has a 1 month-old baby. Okay, let's get into our Brazilian Grand Prix. So Theris is our first comment from the Patreon Discord, who says, I reckon you should actually make time for the preview this time. Yes, me and Van Gene failed. And we didn't even notice we'd failed. We got to the end of the show and went, oh no, that whole thing was meant to be the Mexican Grand Prix preview. So Interlagos, is this high on your list of tracks? Certainly doing it in the sim, watching it on TV. It's an iconic layout. It's it's got a lot of history around it, an atmosphere to rival any Grand Prix circuit. It's just one of my absolute favourites.
I think it's on par with Silverstone as the best track in F1 history. I think if you look at every single race we have there, we're very rarely let down. I can think maybe once in the last decade where we've had a boring race there. And you think it's every single year we've had it be the finale, we've just had drama. Unfortunately, money talks and we know why the Abu Dhabi is the last race. But this, for pure racing, for pure drama, it's just set up perfectly. And as you mentioned, the weather plays like Silverstone, plays an important role in just bringing us some great drama and races.
You've just reminded me, you've made me feel sad, because to me it feels quite recent that Interlagos wasn't the finale. But so 2008, that was that great finale between Lewis Hamilton and Felipe Massa. So it's not that long ago. When did it stop being the final race?
2013. So you're 11 years into Abu Dhabi being the finale, which is just tragic, really, when you think back to it. But I actually did a recent video looking back at every single finale Interlagos was in the F1 calendar. And there actually isn't a race that didn't provide us drama. It was every single race was a banger. And then you look at it and you compare that to Abu Dhabi, I mean, you'd be very hard to come by, other than 2021, an actual race that provided any level of drama.
So on paper, Interlagos shouldn't really be still a great circuit to go to. It could easily be Hungaroring. So like, the size of it is fairly similar. It's narrow at points. It's very twisty with a lot of slow corners where you just can't overtake. But it has some really special features that make it brilliant for racing. So firstly, I think the S's, the turn one, the center chicane, that is one of the most iconic corners. And I think it's similar in Dakota in that you can kind of attack. You can take a few different lines through there. I think that's key.
Yeah, definitely. We see overtakes on the inside and the outside. That's what's brilliant about this corner, is that primarily the racing line is a wide entry into the apex, so it opens the invitation for drivers to send it down the inside, unless your name is Lance Stroll and you don't see drivers coming up your inside.
Oh, hang on. I was going to say, hang on. I've got to defend Stroll. I was just thinking this, like a random shower thought, and I went, it's been ages since Lance Stroll just randomly turned in on someone who he didn't see in his mirrors. So it hasn't happened for a while. Let's be fair.
That's because the Aston Martin is running absolutely nowhere and he's normally out on track on his own. So he doesn't have anyone to crash into, to be fair.
He's the last one, the Silverstone one, where he drove into Alonso and sent him flying. Now, there must have been one since then.
Oh, I can't. To be honest, Lance Stroll hasn't even been on my radar for the last half a season.
But yes,
has he been on yours? Like, it just,
no, it's gone.
I mean, that's a positive for Lance Stroll. He's not.
I agree.
and missed Apex of the Weekend award. He hasn't been that for quite some time. So,
No. Take that as a positive, because we've always said about the likes of Logan Sargent is, okay, you're a bit off the pace, but you're also drawing attention to yourself week in, week out. And if you look at the drivers who that really cost, you got Mazepin, Schumacher, De Vries, and Sargent, because they're making a big mess of the car as well as being off pace. If you just Guan Yu Zhou it, then you get away with it. No one really mentions Zhou Guan Yu.
There's a big caveat, though. None of them own the team. So he could even do that, as he has done for the last 8 years. And it still wouldn't matter for him. But going back to actual turn one corner in that section, that's okay. The turn I thought we'd get it back to Interlagos is that because of the nature of that, the different lines, as you mentioned, and how the racing line is, we see great overtakes around the outside where drivers use the extra grip available, and we get side-by-side action, not just through those couple of corners, but continuing down to turn 4. I think that's the great thing of the first sector in particular. The middle sector is okay, but the first sector in particular is just all about where the overtakes are done. And it's one of the few areas, until you get down to turn 4, where drivers now can force others off the circuit, as we know. We at least see, through the center races, we see cars going side by side. And I mean, look at Alonso and Perez, like how good a battle that was last year.
Yeah, so what you've almost got the opposite to what you have in Mexico, where it guarantees that they're spread out into the overtaking zones. Here, you've got that final corner up the hill. You can follow. So if you follow really close, you might lose a bit of front end. But 2021 Hamilton, that was such a good example where he was going through the pack, and I think he got stuck behind Vettel eventually, and he kept losing the front end to Vettel. And you saw him actually deliberately go into that corner more behind so that he could keep a little bit of front wing, break a bit earlier and get a run. And so there's things you can do like that in Interlagos, and it's not over when you get to turn 1. So if you manage to go side by side or manage to stay close, then you've got another run down to turn 4 as well. And the rest of the track is very tight and twisty. But if you had that, your indoor go-kart track, you'd be delighted. If you had 2 corners in a row where you could attack, and then, obviously it's about lap time. But do you keep your DRS advantage? Is there 1 detection point, or is there 2?
No. So it used to be, I believe, similar to Mexico, where the first 2 DRS detection points, there is only 2 at Interlagos, were back-to-back. So you would maintain it, and it ruined any sort of, the driver that gets overtaken into turn 1, it ruined any sort of potential comeback, and the front driver who's just made the overtake could just drive off, and there'd be no overtake or possible wheel-to-wheel racing into turn 4. They altered that, I think, a couple of years ago because they acknowledged that was the case, and now there's a second detection zone, I think, through the center S's or just on the exit of turn 3 maybe, to ensure that the driver that's coming back who's just been overtaken can have an opportunity of going side by side. And that's what we saw from Alonso. Like Alonso last year, F1 put out a great video actually, just kind of reminiscing on last year, like a 5-minute video. And Alonso was saying, I thought when Perez got past me, that was it. But then he made a slight little mistake into center S's, and then I was able to have that drive and overtake down into turn 4, and of course they came across the finish line side by side, which we've seen multiple times at Interlagos. But it's also a track. Yeah. It's also a track that, like, it's, as you mentioned, how do you set up the car? Because you need the downforce for the middle sector, but you also need obviously enough top speed and a lack of drag to ensure that you can overtake where it matters. And what that does, it really puts pressure on the tires. And tyre management is really a big factor here with different temperatures and different weather conditions. And just all of that combined together. I mean, if you wanted everything that you wanted in an F1 race, all those ingredients, chuck it in a bowl, you get Silverstone and you get Interlagos.
Yeah, well, you could also say you've got to kind of choose really here. Do you do the ultimate qualifying pace? So I'm guessing that would be a little bit more downforce. Or do you make yourself not vulnerable in the race by taking off a little wing?
Yeah, definitely. I think track position here isn't the be all and end all. I would say so. as we've seen at other circuits where it has been very important, I think at Interlagos we're going to see lots of overtakes. We always have done, and because of the nature of the DRS, and because we're not as at a high altitude as we have just come from in Mexico, the DRS is more effective, and yeah, we're going to see some great racing. But I say we're going to see some great racing with how the drivers took their approach at Mexico. With, of course, them all going, okay, well, if that's how we go racing now ahead at the apex, I mean, I think we're going to see a few shoves off at turn 1, at turn 4. Might spoil the wheel-to-wheel racing that we so want.
Hayden's just popped in with a handy little map for the DRS zone. So I think this is quite key when you're looking forward to the race and you're trying to make, in your head, you should practice watching a race. I always think, watch at least one of the practice sessions, but there's only one. So if you're in the UK, that's in the middle of the day before, yeah, that's right. And then you've got sprint qualifying. It's a sprint weekend. So you've got sprint qualifying. And then the next day, after lunch for us, is the sprint race. And then towards dinner time, or tea time if you're wrong and northern, then that is the real qualifying, and then the race is on Sunday. So Hayden's said there, yeah, the DRS detection zone is it before the final turn. So that makes sense. And then also before the S's. So basically, you can't really game that. You either don't make the overtake and then you don't have DRS, and then you have DRS, or you go for the overtake and then your opponent's going to get the DRS. So I think that makes more sense.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just looking at it now. So there's a strategic element, isn't there, to overtaking, but normally you want to be the driver that is ahead into turn 1 because you can kind of just park it on the inside of turn 4, try and make the driver, even with DRS, go around the long way. As we know, head at the apex rule now. I feeling we might see a return of, maybe not so as bad, but we're going to see a return of what Max did in 2021, I think.
Okay, I don't think we're going to be able to get away with talking about the rules. I know some people might be fatigued with the odd thing about talking about the rules, but we do have the first reckon. John H. reckons this on a voice note in our Patreon Discord. You can go there by joining us on patreon.com/missedapex.
I reckon now that Max has been penalized, he'll totally drive to the regular driving standards we expect.
Okay, so my instinct is to say, don't put on a Mickey Mouse voice, John. But if that is really your voice, then I apologize completely. And wow, what wonderful diction you have. So he reckons, I think sarcastically, that Max Verstappen is going to adhere to these racing rules now that he's been penalized. It's an interesting concept. I'm going to lead with saying I don't actually think it's going to affect how he is driving at all. So I know there was a lot of talk about, yes, Verstappen's really good at exploring these grey areas. And yeah, there was this area in the rule where, technically it didn't say you have to stay on track on the inside. It also doesn't say you can't throw banana skins either. But I think he's always just driven that way. So he drove that way in 2021, even when you weren't allowed to. He's done it with this Apex rule. But then again, in Mexico, he attempted the same thing and was I think played well by Lando Norris, who was looking at the rules from the previous race. I don't think Max is some genius in the grey area of the rules. If I'm honest, that's not the perception I've had. I think he just does what he does. So even with a 20-second penalty, I think he came away from that feeling pretty happy because he knew, just like when Hamilton was going to overtake him at Monza and he had a slower car in 21, he knew, well, if I just let him go past now, that's it. He's gone and I've got no chance to catch him. So I may as well stick my foot in. I've got nothing to lose. And he came away from that points neutral. And it worked out for him. And he thinks it worked out for him by basically stopping Norris from attempting to overtake Carlos Sainz. Because after all of that, even though he got a 20-second penalty, he was able to then keep Lando Norris behind for how many laps? 10, 20 laps until the next pit stop, which wrecked Lando Norris's race. So as far as he's concerned, I think Verstappen comes out of that thinking that was the right thing to do. I would do it again. But I can't see the rules. If they're enforced the same way, I think he still makes the same decision.
100%. I think the thing is, Max actually was racing to the rules in Mexico. He just took it over that line of what is deemed acceptable with his second move. But the first move, he's doing what he thinks is right. He's playing to the rules. He thought he was ahead at the apex compared to Lando. We saw Lando launched it around the outside, and you see he knew exactly what Lando was doing in that split second, but he nearly ran into the back of Sainz. If Sainz wasn't there,
oh my God, yeah,
I actually think Max might have been ahead at the apex.
Good point, yeah.
And he would have been entitled, Lando would have been the one who had to give that position back. But, of course, he then took the rules to the extreme of what the drivers have been complaining about, where he just launched his car into the apex of turn 7, turn 8, I think it was. And it was basically a bin it or win it type situation. I'm ahead at the apex. Max has always left these decisions to be decided by the stewards. And he's always been on the favourable end of stewards' decisions. There's a history of evidence that shows us that. So why would he not just leave it in the stewards? Again, when was the last time a drive-through penalty was actually dished out to someone?
Yeah.
And I think that's more of a suitable, I know he's talking about Mexico, but I don't think, as you said, Spaz, I don't think we're going to see a change in that mentality in Brazil or any of the remaining races, because if Lando crashes out, if they end up crashing out, Max is pretty much champion.
Yep.
Lando cannot afford to not have a race where he doesn't score points. And Max is, I'm not saying Max is intentionally going out there to crash, but it is that, well, you either back out or your championship's over and done with mentality. And if he knows a 10-second time penalty now is the worst he's going to get, he'll accept that because he's got a car that's quick enough to still to finish in the top 6, top 5. And if it stops Lando from winning, well, there's not a big enough points advantage for Lando to close up the gap. But I actually think, I've got just touching on Mexico one last bit. I actually think the stewards were deliberating giving Max a harsher penalty. Now, there's been no comment from the stewards on this because the time it took for them to issue the penalty at turn 4 was very quick. Time it took for them to issue the penalty at turn 7, which, bearing in mind, is only a couple of corners later, it took them around 5 or 6 laps to issue that. Yeah. And it was only for gaining an advantage off the racing surface. Whereas, as everyone has said afterwards and pretty much agreed, it was dirty driving, and it was it should have been put down as dangerous driving, and he should have had a drive-through. That's my opinion. I think that's a lot of others as well. So I'd love to hear if the stewards actually were deliberating that, because it took an abnormal amount of time for that penalty, for that incident to be resolved.
So the penalty wasn't for dangerous driving, though. It was for leaving the track and gaining an advantage. So from that point of view, that's fairly consistent. So he either has the choice to give the place back, or it's a 10-second penalty, and that's been fairly consistent for a few seasons now.
Yes, So the 10-second time penalty actually only just this season. So if you remember last season, the drivers and the teams were fussing, but 5-second time penalties were being given out for basically every little misdemeanor. Yeah. And you was able to nullify that 5-second time penalty. So at the start of this season, they went 10-second time penalty for gaining advantage off the track is what will be dished out. But forcing another driver off the track where you're the inside car and behind at the apex, I don't think that was clarified as 10 seconds. So that's why it should be 5 seconds. So that's why really Max's penalty, the first one, should have really been 5 seconds, because that's consistent with what has been applied throughout the course of this year. The 10-second one was consistent, but I think they were deliberating giving it for dangerous driving, and then I don't know, Johnny Herbert, as I'm sure we'll get on to, maybe he was pushing for dangerous driving, and they had a bit of back and forth and went, no, we can't do that. It's not necessarily black and white, but I think it pretty much is. I think you've got the telemetry to show he was never, ever going to make that corner.
You have to sort of prove it's deliberate. And Max's defense was, well, you can't get in my head. So how do you prove it's deliberate? So I'm going to challenge you slightly on saying, there's a history of the decisions going his way. I think I broadly sympathise with that. However, the decisions didn't go his way last week. And we are going to talk about the stewards. I think there is a strong opinion that there is one particular steward and there seems to be a pattern of those decisions going Max's way for one steward. I'm not satisfied to then go, well, all of the FIA, all of the stewards are, somehow conspiring together to let Max get away with everything. So, but there is one thing in your favour, which is if there was another driver driving the way Max Verstappen does, would they clock up penalties, penalty points, and race bans? And thankfully, we have Kevin Magnussen as absolute proof that if you drive, playing the referee, and as Strauss says in the chat, it's a matter of it's a tactic used in sport. Oh, sorry, this is Hayden. A tactic used in sport. I don't enjoy that mentality in sport, but that was in response to Strauss saying it's a tactical foul. Dare the referees to call every single foul. So, you can do that in football, and then you can complain to the referee, oh, you're breaking up the flow of play. And that's what was happening in 2021, is that the teams were saying, no, let's have this mentality of let them race, stop getting in the way. And that was basically right. If you don't get in the way, that suits Verstappen's style of driving because he's much more aggressive. If you over-referee it, those things are kind of going to get called out more. And so we have this situation now where a set of stewards massively disagreed with the previous set of stewards. And I think they really applied, it was more or less the same situation. I think there was no actual description of what the defending car needs to do. That's a bit of a red herring. Other technical regulations cover that more than adequately, that you're not allowed to just drive someone off and you go off the track. You obviously can't do that. But then there's some controversy around the stewards. So there have been a lot of Verstappen fans, as a lot of in my inbox, absolutely outraged and making these tweets without irony that there shouldn't be stewards that have strong links to some teams. And you go, okay, but none of them were referencing the other steward we were talking about. They were all saying it as if this was like brand new news. And actually, I have a little bit of sympathy with that. I'd want a little bit more of a pattern rather than just one race where two fairly clear fouls were penalised. But there was a steward who has links to a founding member of the McLaren team, so the son of a founding member of the McLaren team. And you go, okay, do they have any grounds to say that's... Yeah, if we're going to complain about links to Honda, then surely a link to the founder of McLaren is a pretty big red flag as well.
Yeah, it is. You can't state that you're upset with links with another driver, and then the next week there's links
to McLaren and you're
for the other team. Yeah, exactly. And look, there's always going to be some level of bias in decisions, or unconscious bias. Like they'll try and apply the rules as fairly as possible. But this is the whole problem. Brings us back to this scenario of why do we not just have a regular panel of stewards that appear at every single race? Okay, maybe one or two of them are in reserve and they rotate them out in case of one wants to go on holiday or someone's sick, but consistency is all anyone wants, really. And even really at this weekend, while it was great to see these actually penalised, there was still a bit of lack of consistency. Sergio Perez should have actually got a penalty for faulting Liam Lawson after the racing surface.
100% agree. And then Lawson should have got one the next corner.
Yeah, and maybe they nullified that because of what Lawson did in return, or because they thought, actually, Sergio's having a rough day as it is. He's got damage to his car and we're not going to issue him a penalty for anything more. But I think everyone just wants consistency. That's all it is. And if we see this weekend, the racing rules, apparently they are going to be revised and they'll be implemented from next year. The drivers aren't happy about that. They want that done now. But funnily enough, the FIA doesn't want to change them now because they want a sense of consistency. But if we get that for the remainder of the season, and those, we know as viewers especially, that if they're ahead at the apex, they're entitled to that corner. At least until the rest of the season, we know what we're looking at and what we're watching, and we should hopefully have a consistent application of the rules. Where
you're not going to get a consistent application, and where what looks like maybe some genuine biases coming in is that if an inside car now just yeets off like in Kota, that is open to interpretation, because you've got to decide whether that is dangerous driving, whether that's driving in an unusual matter.
Well, actually, touching on the dangerous driving of Max, they did deem it dangerous driving because he got 2 penalty points
Oh, good point.
on his license. I think it was for that incident. I've seen some people say it was turn 4, but I don't think it was. Pretty sure he got 2 penalty points. So that right there indicates that they deemed that to be well outside the racing rules, unacceptable, and they've given him penalty points on his license for it.
I'm going to because we're looking forward, so I've got a little bit more on the stewards that we've got. And the stewards shouldn't be the story. I think that's a big problem. But now everybody is paying massive attention to who the stewards are for each race. That's an issue for Formula One. Karen says, wasn't that founder pushed out, though? Wouldn't that sour them on the team? I don't know. So that's a great question. Somebody give us a bit of a history of those links to McLaren. But there's also a steward who was one of my favourite TV pundits and an ex-driver who, it's fair to say in the media, certainly, expressed favour towards one driver or another during their time during commentary. And I think that is perfectly fine. Try and find a board of football officials when none of them support a football team. You're not going to get that. Every NFL fan supports an NFL team. Every baseball fan supports a baseball team. I'd like the Savannah Banana people because they're good on the TikToks. But it's stupid to say, oh, you're passionate about F1 and you don't have a preference for one driver or another, or one team or another. You're honestly telling me you don't have a result that makes you happier? And I've had arguments with big journalists in Formula One, and I made one of the grown-up journalists angry enough to DM me, actually, when I said, like, you're lying. This is what upset them. I said, you're lying if you're saying you don't have a bias or a preference, because there will be one set of results that make you more excited than others. But if you present your journalism as fully neutral, which you're kind of obliged to do to a certain extent, then you have to adjust artificially. And when you have an opinion, we don't get to know that bias. With me, you know my biases, and you can judge that accordingly. But if you're going out there sort of with a false neutrality, I called it a lie. I shouldn't have called it a lie. I think it makes it awkward. But look at any football panel. You've got Gary Lineker on Match of the Day, Leicester City fan. Ian Wright, Arsenal fan. International sport is even worse. Like the partisan nature of that. Look at an England soccer game, and you've got Gary Neville going absolutely mad if England score, and Roy Keane looking sick as a dog because he's disgusted that England have scored. So I don't think we can actually dial out the fact that some stewards are going to be affiliated or going to be a fan with another driver. You can look for patterns of where that has affected decisions, but I don't think you can get rid of it.
No, you can't. And I think that the way to move forward is that if they're really not going to have a set of assistant professional stewards that turn up week in, week out, then there needs to be a set level of accountability and review of decisions that are made throughout the course of the year. Now, if it happens to be that a driver, whoever that may be, gets decisions... I mean, how many times have we heard the FIA come out a week later and say, yeah, they should have been given a penalty for that or given a warning for that? That's no good. So there should be a review of if consistent poor decisions are made, and the FIA are having to keep coming out and saying, look, that should have been dealt with at the time or whatever, then that stewards or those stewards should basically be sacked. I mean, I get 6 monthly reviews on how I'm doing in my job. What's different with them, and especially when it has such influence on a lot of money. I mean, these teams have got a lot of money on offer with their constructors, and of course the drivers as well, which if your driver's world champion, it can result in you earning millions of more pounds in sponsorship and so forth. So yeah, it's moving forward, consistency. That's all we want.
Moving forward, we now care who the stewards are going to be. So my last bit on that will be, saying who the stewards are, because they've become a big player and it's become a point of interest. I wouldn't normally even think about it, but it is Dr. Gerd Eisner, member of the DMSB Executive Committee for Automobile Sport. Oh, he's a DTM steward as well. That's good. Andrew Melelu, and he's the president of the Barbados Motoring Federation. All right. Jonathan Herbert Formula One driver and 3-time Grand Prix winner. Used to be on Sky
Who's
Sports.
Who's that?
Johnny Herbert and Luciano Berti as well, who is a national steward. So there you go. There's the stewards, and you can factor that into your race predictions, I think. Anthony Scaramento says, I reckon between Russell's tyre wear, Antonelli being 18, and the team's desire to move on from this regulation set, Mercedes' best case for 2025 is a distant fourth in the constructors and might even be closer to Aston Martin, Haas, VCARB or Williams than to P3 Red Bull, who will, of course, be throwing the constructors again to get more wind tunnel time. Yeah, that's okay. So we'll Mercedes in a second, but I want to put this to you, Scott. I made the case, I think about 6 months ago when we were talking to Jessica Smetana on here, that tanking is now a thing in Formula One. So you can tank the World Constructors Championship if you want. And actually, we were accusing at the time Alpine. So we were trying to think of a reason why Alpine was so far back. But they could halt development, watch themselves drop back the grid a little bit, and then give themselves more wind tunnel time for next year when you'll also be developing the 2026 car. So if you look at how Red Bull have fallen so far back, they've got the lead driver in the Drivers' Championship, but they're now third and unlikely to win back second place in the Constructors' Championship. So that means they're going to get more wind tunnel time, but they're going to lose prize money. So let's say that's deliberate. Let's say they're happy for Perez's form to have been going on like that, and they lose 30 million in prize money, but gain 15% in wind tunnel time, then they've just bought 15% extra wind tunnel time for 30 million. And I'm not sure how mad I am about it. That looks like a legitimate loophole in the rules.
Yeah, I think it's a simple business decision. These teams are businesses at the end of the day. And when you've got a driver whose benefactor is Carlos Slim and it has allegedly paid a considerable amount of money. We know he backs Sergio Perez quite some way and has allegedly fronted up a considerable amount of money. If I'm Christian Horner, and for all my criticisms of Christian and my kind of dislike of him, I cannot deny how shrewd he is and how much of a good businessman he is. I mean, he is, if you want a team principal, he is like your ideal team principal. He will die on a hill for your driver. He will just, he's great in the media as much as you may like him. He riles the right people up who you want to be riled up. And if I'm him, I am no doubt saying to Carlos Slim, well, look, if you seriously want Perez to stay in this seat, you have to basically make up the difference in the constructors from third to first. And
you still get your wind tunnel time.
Exactly. It's simple maths. And then you're still earning the money that you are from Sergio Perez. You're not losing any money and you're only gaining. But even so, even if that isn't the case, and as you said, you're paying 30 million for more wind tunnel time.
Happy accident.
When your team has no doubtedly taken, of course, the cost cap penalty, and we knew that there'd eventually be a bit of a knock on. I think I'm still of the mind that something a bit more dubious has been removed from the car. But
that's outrageous, Scott. Outrageous. I can't believe you pointed out the obvious pattern.
There is no doubt the element that they haven't developed as well. And potentially the wind tunnel time, the lack of wind tunnel time has now finally caught up to them, whereas the other teams have been able to use the extra time. And especially with a new set of regs coming up, that extra wind tunnel time is more important than it's ever going to be in a third year of the current reg set when they pretty much know everything about the car already.
All right, so if you want to say, okay, obviously that is a conspiracy theory, I've got really nothing to base it on. But when you go, this is what I've said to the kids, when something doesn't make any sense, think about money and who can profit from it. So when you see like weird projects or a hospital's half built and then not built, I go, yeah, think about the money. Or for example, PAT testing legislation is massively over the top. And I know, hang on a second. Hang on, legally. The lawyer's got in my head. But,
going down a rabbit hole now.
There's lots of legislation where you kind of go, who's benefiting from that financially? And so Perez's drop off in form is so strange. And then there's this really happy coincidence where actually, in the end, it turns out there's no net loss for Red Bull. It should be a disaster that you've got your second drivers that far back, yet somehow it's ended up advantaging them. You kind of go, ooh, there was some advantages there.
Yeah, it's going to be one that's difficult to prove because they're never really. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure there's obviously loads of back channels that they can make certain payments through and so forth. But then, as you said, is there anything particularly in the regulations that say a benefactor can't give a team X amount of money for a driver, and how they utilise that, as long as it isn't going specifically towards the cost cap, goes towards their bottom line as an actual company, then they're going to take that. So,
are Mercedes in trouble, Scott?
I think Mercedes have been in trouble since the start of 2022. To be honest with you, I think they just completely got it wrong. They've been chasing ever since, and I think they know they just this set of regulations they want to end sooner rather than later. And next year is just a development year for them. It's a year to develop Kimi Antonelli and get him familiar with F1. And it's a year for them to assess whether or not George Russell is the right man to lead this team moving forward, in my opinion. I think all the talk's been about Antonelli. There is so much pressure on George Russell's shoulders next year. And I think if he doesn't sort out his own issues in the car, I think he could be on his way out in 2026.
I'm really interested to see the dynamic because this year Hamilton's been sort of powerless because the team were never going to get Russell to go out of the way. Yeah, I know you're loyal to us and you didn't sign a contract with our direct rivals. However, please get out of the way of the driver who did that right at the beginning of the season. He's always been to a bit of a loser there. But there's this weird mismatch of tactics that I've been, going on about where Russell is favouring a qualifying setup. Russell wants to just get ahead, use everything at the beginning of the race, even if there's a disadvantage towards the end. Hamilton's just had to lump it, and I don't think he's even fighting it. There was a race a couple of races ago where he caught up 8 seconds and then didn't really push for an overtake. Yeah, okay, you could say I haven't quite got the delta, but ordinarily in any other team now, with that kind of difference in strategy and that kind of closing up of the gap, you'd go, all right, get out of his way so he can go up the road and try and fight someone. Is that what are they going to do that to Antonelli? Is Antonelli going to come up against the same problems? Because if he does, I think it will be different to this year. So this year, any argument with Lewis Hamilton is, well, it's people saying, oh no, it's because he's washed versus people like us who are trying to defend it. So if it's Antonelli, there'll be a fresh start. And I think we'll be able to see it all in a neutral point of view. And I actually think the issues might be more highlighted if it's the same, if it's with a different personality. So if we keep seeing Russell doing this and being in Antonelli's way, I think that's going to be a lot less popular than because now everyone's kind of looking ahead. People are drinking beer at night and ordering merch online and still pretty scared about what they ordered.
Yeah, I think Russell's been a bit short-sighted in the fact that he's just so focused on beating Lewis. But he needs to sit back and go, as you just mentioned, Lewis has checked out. Lewis checked out start of this season, really. I think it was only when he realised Mercedes had an opportunity at a few races where they've got set specific conditions, Silverstone, Spa, where he can win races, and you see Lewis get really buoyant when he sees an opportunity for a race win. But mostly he's been accepting of just where the team is. He wants to go out on a good note at least, which I think he's going to now. And George has just been fully focused on beating Lewis, whereas he needs to think about himself and his development. Now, I know obviously, how old is George Russell? Is he 26? I mean, he's still young, so he's been around for quite some time.
He's not new and shiny, though.
No, because he was in Williams, but he's still young in F1 driver sense. And there's still a lot for him to develop. But
26.
In their day, Max Verstappen, as we know, like Toto openly admitted he courted Max. While he's got Antonelli, he's got Antonelli there. George Russell, who used to be the favourite son, has now just been kicked out the door. And all the pressure is going to be on George next year. And I think, especially with his tyre management, I mean, that's the only reason Lewis really had an opportunity to catch him and overtake him in Mexico. George had that race if he had Lewis's ability of managing tyres or Max's ability, then he could have not even worried about Lewis in that race. And I think, yes, next year, Antonelli might, of course, is going to be rough around the edges and might not have that tyre management ability from the get-go. But as we know, if he's got more raw pace than George, that's something that can be learned, and he'll then seat will be at risk, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, we have to mention the fact that there was some front wing damage. So it might have evened out because there was front wing damage for Russell, and Hamilton was carrying some floor damage from the Antonelli floor damage in FP1 as well. I think we have to keep an eye on that. If they do suddenly drop away from the front three, I think it's fair to start looking at the drivers. But in F1, you don't know. They could have fluffed more update packages. But the way it's looking is that basically the top four are closing in on each other for 2025. We are expecting a top four throughout the season where anyone can win. Like this season, we've had Verstappen win, Norris, Piastri. Is it all the top seven and not Perez? Is it
all the top seven have won multiple times? Oh, apart from George, I think it's maybe was George won twice or has he won once?
Has Russell won a race this year, chat?
He has won a race.
Yeah.
I'm trying to. He won Austria, didn't he? He lucked through there and won that race. Okay, I think maybe George has won once, but yeah, basically Perez is the only driver who hasn't won once, or multiple times this season.
So that's going to be. I think that's going to continue next season, all things being equal. If they really do drop off into a clear fourth place, we probably will start looking at the drivers there. All right, then. Where do we go next? We've done stewards to death. There was one comment about Verstappen. There's a little bit of stuff on Verstappen, but I don't... This is what other people are saying. Oh, yeah. So there's a potential engine penalty coming for Brazil, and that'll be a 5-place penalty. Now, that will be key, because if that puts him behind Norris, then he can't do the thing of trying to interfere with Norris's race. So that will be absolutely key if he has to take that.
Definitely. And it's whether or not he has to take any new parts around that engine as well. So I think the actual power unit itself alone is 5th place.
Is it? I thought the ICU was 10.
Well, this is it. I don't know how it works. I think I've got it a bit confused because you see Liam Lawson, you've seen Yuki Tsunoda take 30, 60 place grid penalties. I thought how the rules initially worked was that once the first penalty above your allocation is 10 place grid penalty, and then beyond that worsens, that gets doubled, or there's an extra 5 places on top of that to stop people just basically taking the same 10 place grid penalty over and over again. But I don't believe that's the case. I think all of them end up just adding up basically if you take all new parts. But yeah, I mean, it's gonna make things interesting, isn't it? Especially with a sprint race this weekend. It's definitely what Norris needs. And how much faster even would that Red Bull be with a new power unit? I mean, we saw it in Spa and it still wasn't overly that quick compared to its competitors. Ferrari still look absolutely amazing. I think they're going to be up there again. I think they're going to be if Norris, I think will be happy dealing with the Ferraris compared to Max, because we mentioned the racing rules.
Well,
it's lending itself again to being just another dramatic weekend, I think.
My suspicion is that Red Bull know they don't have the race pace. So if they lean towards the Saturday pace, if you look at it, they have been the best performing qualifiers on a Saturday. Singapore, just really out of their league. They're punching above their weight. They clearly don't have that performance in the race. So that could well be deliberate, because if they go, okay, well, let's favour race pace, we're still going to drop behind the Ferraris. We're still going to drop behind the McLarens. So we're P5 anyway, and that's without the Mercedes doing anything. So why not favour some qualifying pace, put some downforce on, and then at least we have a say. If we have track position, at least we can have a say. And that's worked out, hasn't it? For the past few events, he's been able to run Norris off track on three separate occasions. He's been able to do it. And that could just well be the plan now. because they've got to run that in. And if you can interfere with Norris enough to stop him winning, that's grand. So I would look out for that as a trend. But if they can't do it in Brazil because they've got to take a 5-second penalty, does that apply in the sprint or will that apply in the main race?
I think it applies in the main race because I think that's what happened with Lawson in Circuit Americas. I think they maybe changed the rule. I thought that you would take it in a sprint race. So you could take an engine penalty at a sprint race weekend, and it means that you've arguably taken the penalty in the sprint race, and then wherever you qualify for the Sunday race is okay. But that isn't what happened with Liam Lawson on the Saturday. Sorry, that isn't what happened with Liam Lawson in Kota. He started from the back on the race on Sunday. But what's also going to be intriguing this weekend as well, and might throw a spanner in the works, no pun intended there, spanners, for this weekend, is that we've got the weather report is currently saying dry on Friday, wet Saturday, wet Sunday. So the sprint race in particular, how do you decide to set up your car? Do you go for that higher downforce, predicting the rain on Saturday? I know they can change their setup between the sprint and qualifying on Saturday. So if it's rain all weekend, they can just set the car up for those conditions. In particular on Friday, it was similar to what we saw in Spa. I think McLaren set up their car for more more dry weather conditions, suffered in qualifying because they didn't have as much downforce for the quali. But then we didn't realize how difficult it was going to be to overtake at Spa, and they ended up arguably not being able to win that race because of their setup choice. I think it's going to be very intriguing again this weekend to see, do you go for track if it is dry qualies and it's wet races? How do the teams how do they approach that? Do they try and go for a more balanced setup? Do they try and go purely for track position, or do they just try and focus on sacrificing some positions in qualifying, or just focusing on the race on Sunday?
All right, should we let's get through a little bit more listener feedback then. I've got some pushback from Carlos Sainz, so I think people felt like I was being unfair. We had some comments in the live chat going, "He's just won a race. Why are you slaughtering him?" And I'm like, look, that's a completely fair point. I think you can say that he had a great weekend. But Scott Rainsford says, I reckon James Vowles is feeling a little bit smug right now in relation to Carlos Sainz. And there was another one, which I'll find in a minute, saying, have Ferrari basically made a mistake by signing Lewis Hamilton now? So I think this happens in a cycle is what gets to me. So like Carlos Sainz, he's very clearly a driver that is capable of turning up on a Grand Prix weekend, dominating the whole weekend and winning. So why do I instinctively then go, well, just do that all the time then? I think that's my thing. And we seem to go through this cycle where he will have a blinder of a weekend. Everyone says, yeah, he's genuinely a top driver and he's up there. And that's a fair thing to do after you have such a blinding weekend, live the dream. But then we kind of go through this loop then where we go through a period where either, he does something wrong or just disappears for a little while, goes behind Leclerc, and then the narrative changes. It flips on its head so quickly to, well, he's not really showed himself against Leclerc. He's had every chance. And then several weekends later, he'll pull another blinding weekend out. I don't think it's unfair completely to point out that pattern and go, what is this?
He's just not consistent enough. I'm a big fan of Carlos Sainz, and I think on his day or on his weekend, he is one of the best drivers on the grid. And it just makes you pull your hair out and go, why can't you do that season?
Yeah.
But because then you'd still have your seat in Ferrari. Because, championship standings don't lie. I know he missed Saudi. So arguably he could be closer in the standings to Charles Leclerc. But he's fifth in the standings on 240 points. And Charles Leclerc is on 291 points. And Charles had that horror show of a run where Ferrari just made poor strategy decisions and he scored like 0 points in 3 or 4 races. And Carlos is great, but ultimately you're not replacing him with anyone. You're replacing him with Lewis Hamilton, for God's sake. Arguably one of the most consistent drivers in F1 history. It was only in 2022 where Mercedes absolutely dropped the ball with their development, but that was the first time in Lewis's career where he hadn't won a race. I mean, that's the record basically that he's got for winning consecutively races in his career since he joined F1, and that's absolutely a crazy stat. So, yeah, James Vowles would be absolutely over the moon. He's signed Carlos Sainz because Alex Albon looks like he's. I mean, I think in the way Alex is ending this season, just to slightly move direction away from Ferrari. I think James Vowles with Colapinto, if he can hold on to him, with of course these rumours that Red Bull are after his services, then I mean James Vowles is in a brilliant position next year with Albon, Sainz, and Colapinto waiting in the wings. Like if one of those don't perform, Colapinto, there you go. Like yeah, James Vowles is going to be absolutely rubbing his hands together that he's got the drivers that he's available next season.
I wonder if they'd have made the decision earlier to move on Logan Sargent. Let's say, before Carlos Sainz had been signed, before they pulled the trigger. Colapinto comes in, performs exactly the same way, throwing it down the inside of Fernando Alonso, looking actually like the sharper driver on occasion with Albon. I think it's hard to get we haven't had a true direct comparison. There have been too many factors in the Williams races. There's been some unreliability and some crashes. But maybe, do you go, well, maybe we don't actually need Sainz if Colapinto started doing that and he's had longer. So by the time we get to the point where he's signing Sainz, you kind of go, maybe we've kind of got our driver pairing now.
I think so. Yes, I do. But then again, Carlos Sainz is a driver who do think would you have him over Alex Albon? I guess that would depend on really Albon's performance. I think because did Albon re-sign at the start of the season or middle with this like earlier on in the year as well?
I think he's got 25 left.
Yeah, so I mean, there definitely would have been some options there for him, whether he decided to replace Albon with Sainz. If, say, Albon's on the run of form he is now and Colapinto hit the ground running like he is. I think we can all agree that they should have just not started this year with Logan Sargent. I mean, he just kept him on for way too long. Once again, money talks, obviously, most likely. But yeah, I mean, you look at Colapinto now, and I mean, Red Bull rumours suggest are true after his services, and he's definitely made an impact on up and down the paddock, but on track primarily. So yeah, James Vowles is in a great place next season, and I'm intrigued to see how Sainz, because I think part of his lack of consistency is his attitude. I think if you look at him at the start of the season when people were going, oh my God, it's been announced that Ferrari is signing Lewis and Carlos Sainz is on his way out. He had a point to prove. He had a point to prove to Ferrari and everyone else, you're making the wrong decision. And he had some great performances. And I even said, tongue in cheek, yeah, maybe he is better than Charles Leclerc. Maybe they're getting rid of the wrong driver. But he then, as he kind of generally does, as that kind of faded, as F1 moves very quickly and that mentality kind of faded, he dropped off in performance. Right. Yeah.
We're getting a bit of pushback, and we do. Anytime, I don't want to be anti-Carlos Sainz. I prefer that he was turning up and delivering and had done enough to show that he should stay at Ferrari. Show Ferrari you don't need Lewis Hamilton, or if Lewis Hamilton's coming in, then it's Charles who's got to go. I've no desire. I've no anti-Spanish agenda or anything like that. So we're getting a bit of pushback, and I think that's fine because he's a driver that has a fan base and a following, and they're defending him. I get that. Leclerc has not been perfect. We criticise Leclerc for making mistakes, over pushing, maybe doing the odd thing on a Friday. That is different to the problem with Sainz. So Sainz can have a weekend where he's got all the pace in the world and he looks great like he did, but most of the weekends on a Sunday he looks substantially slower than Leclerc. And so which driver are you going to have? The one that on the whole has the better race pace, but is, making mistakes, over pushes, compromises himself in quali and practice sometimes, or the driver who for most of the races doesn't have as good a race pace as his teammate? I'm sorry, Carlos Sainz fan. I am sorry. That is a no-brainer decision from my fantasy F1 manager sofa position.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, there's the business element of it as well. I mean, Lewis Hamilton is so much more lucratively viable than Carlos Sainz, with due respect.
Yeah.
But I think people are, yes, Charles Leclerc, as we've always criticised him of being streaky himself and still having these mistakes. We've still seen him crash in FP1 this season. Baku comes to mind. But if you actually run back and look through every single race this year, Charles Leclerc has finished when Ferrari haven't been at fault for his positions of where he's qualified, or of course poor strategy, i.e. Canada comes to mind and Silverstone as well. I mean, Silverstone quality was kind of his fault, I think, as well. But primarily, Charles Leclerc has been one of the most consistent drivers on the grid. He hasn't finished pretty much outside the top 5 in every single race this year where he hasn't been at fault for something. So Ferrari have pretty much ruined his championship chances this year. And that's I mean, look at Monaco. Monaco, he was 31 points behind Max.
Oh,
and
don't
then he went,
say that.
And then he went on that run. DNF. Austria was a poor weekend for them because they ballsed up qualifying there. Silverstone, but there was like a run of 4 or 5 races in a row. I think sandwiched in between there was a 5th place in Barcelona, but even Singapore, he had a car to be on the front row and be wedged right in that gap between Lando and Max. And Ferrari decided to just not turn the tyre blankets on for some reason.
Oh, God, yeah.
So he qualified 9th. He finished 5th in the end, which is great at Singapore, but in a car that should really be pushing for the win. So, or at least not that far behind Lando, well ahead of Max. So Charles has actually been super consistent this year, and I think he's going to raise his game when Lewis Hamilton arrives next year, as kind of most drivers would, because it's Lewis Hamilton.
Last one then. We have Rob Asher, who says, I reckon that McLaren will go backwards in 2025, and this year is their best chance of a championship. It's not impossible. They've definitely not been peaking at the beginning of the season. So they've not had like an Aston Martin or a Ferrari trajectory where they look strongest at the beginning of the season and then they're kind of hanging on with their updates. And the updates are coming thick and fast still. So Chris Stevens gave me this statistic that this season's Sauber, I think he said this season's Sauber was faster than last season's Red Bull. Now that's how much the cars are stepping up. That's how much the development has an issue. And McLaren now, yes, they're ahead of Red Bull on pace and development, but I agree with Stuffy that Red Bull have had some significant drawbacks, some significant hurdles in the road when it comes to their development, and they have lost relatively to Ferrari. So it's a really fun situation to be in where the guys driving for the championship aren't in the fastest cars come the end of the season. I think there's no doubt at the moment the Ferraris are the fastest cars. Have we got? Yeah, they are. Yeah. They're the fastest cars on track, and that's probably ruining Lando Norris's run at the title. But
actually,
go on.
Sorry, I said yes. I do think McLaren is still just ahead of Ferrari, but they're being let down by their drivers.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's the great game of chess in F1. You can never quite tell.
Yeah, I think they are, and I think the pace of Lando on Sunday, especially. I mean, he should have really been at least front row. I think he had a time in him to, like Carlos Sainz, to basically be very close to him, a couple of hundredths of a second or something for qualifying, and he should have really won that race. Of course, we know what happened with Max, but I mean, look at Piastri. Piastri's really fallen off, and say fallen off's a hard word, but he's going for a bit of bad form, and he's being a terrible teammate, and
yeah.
he could be the reason McLaren don't win the constructors, and how unbelievably bad would that be, McLaren? And I think Rob makes a great point, because how long did it take them to kind of admit that they would issue team orders with Lando? They never quite believed that Lando was in the fight for the World Drivers' Championship, and it was all about the constructors. Imagine they lose both. They don't win either of them. And as Rob says, next year, they aren't the fastest car out of the box, and they're chasing again. And Ferrari are, or Red Bull get their act together, or Mercedes do. Like, there's no guarantee of how close F1 is right now, but you're going to be in a position to win either one of these championships next year.
I've got a funny feeling. That Norris is not out of it. I think if it rains, my heart will sink a little bit. If it rains, I'll go, That's Verstappen
Max will be
territory.
wanting it to rain, won't it?
Yeah, definitely. Do you remember that? Was it 2018 when he was teammates with Ricciardo, and it rained, and suddenly Verstappen just instinctively was finding grip where other people were struggling, and he lapped Ricciardo, I think.
Yeah, I think so. But Lando also is very good in the rain. He's very underrated. He doesn't get enough credit for how he drives in the rain as well. You go back to when we've had rain qualifying sessions, he has always been up there.
Oh.
Always been up there. Like I think people look back to the decisions of where he stayed on slick tyres too long, but that's changing conditions to wet weather. But when actually in the rain, Lando's very good. But in regards to competitors, Max will definitely be hoping for the rain because he knows his driver skill. He reckons his driver skill would probably be able to, as rain is the great nullifier, get him up to maybe the Ferraris.
So I'm not saying that Lando Norris can't drive in the rain. I think that, like, if you look at Verstappen and Hamilton, they have a track record of being consistently fantastic in the rain and pulling off these amazing performances. There was a Monaco Grand Prix as well on full wets with Hamilton versus Rosberg, and when the rain came down,
remember that?
Do you remember Rosberg just disappeared, couldn't get any heat in the tyres, and I think Hamilton lapped Rosberg out of Monaco, and I think they are the two drivers that have set themselves apart when it comes to not like interchangeable conditions, but like a wet track. Those two are by far the best drivers in the field. I think if it's raining, you go, that gives Max Verstappen a way back at the McLarens and a way back at the Ferraris that probably doesn't exist in the dry. So especially with a 5-place grid penalty. But I think, if this weekend Max Verstappen's going to be in the carbon fiber zone, he's going to be right there in that zone with Tsunoda, Gasly, and Albon doing what they did at Mexico. Could be collateral damage. I think it's a dangerous weekend for him in the championship. Doesn't have the opportunity to run Norris off track or to interfere with Norris's race. And if McLaren and Lando Norris can nail a win while all of that is happening, it's game on. But it's got to be more than 10 points. So let's do our maths. Everyone. Forget the sprint race.
I know it off the top of my head.
Okay, so 26 for the win, right?
Yeah.
So for win and fastest lap, you got 26, right? And then 18 for second, 15, 12. So you want Verstappen, is that right? 18, 15, 12.
Yeah, so that's why Max is making these. That's the thinking behind Max in what he did last weekend is that if the advantage from P1 to P2 is 7 points. From P2 to P4, like 5 points, 4 points. Like it's not enough. It's not enough for Lando to finish, for Max to finish top 5 and Lando to finish second. He has to win. No,
I think I think if he comes away from the Grand Prix winning the race with Max in sort of 6th, 7th territory, then we're still game on, and he's got to not lose points to him at any point. That includes the sprint weekend as well. So look, the championship is still on. There's a great racetrack ahead. There's loads of action with the sprint weekend. We have a lot to look forward to. There's a live watch along. That's the only live watch along worth watching, and it is with Scott Stuffy Tuffy. It's huge. There's lots of people there. There's a bustling community. So go and follow him at his weirdly spelled YouTube channel. And look, he won't admit to regretting it, but there's so many different U's and F's and E's and stuff like that. Tell people how to find you.
You can find me on YouTube at Stuffy, STUFFEYY. It's my last name, so don't have a go. Actually, there's an extra Y on the end because someone else already had.
So it's not your name, is it?
I wanted.
Right.
No, it isn't. But yeah, so STUFFEYY. It'll be in the show notes below. You can
if
find
I
us
remember.
There. If Spanners remembers, I will ensure he remembers. And yeah, I'll be live for every session this weekend. So come and join us.
If Matt's on the show, it gets put in the show notes. If it's just me, I mean, I still say all the same things, but who knows? And you can follow me as well at Spanners Ready on Twitter. There are some exciting projects coming up. So we've got a YouTube channel for the Missed Apex Moto GP. So if you're a Moto GP fan, go and check them out on YouTube and their audio podcast. They are a year old. Happy birthday to the Missed Apex Moto GP podcast. A lovely growing audience and community there as well. I'm proud of those guys. They've really put together a nice podcast there. We are recording a Formula E podcast this second. So after this, me and Christina and Chris are having a look ahead to the new Formula E season as well. And you can support us on patreon.com/missedapex. That's the reason we get to do all this stuff and get to do midweek shows and actually remember to do the preview this time. Until we see you next, work hard, be kind, and have fun. This was Missed Apex Podcast.